All right, we are ready to go again. It's my very great pleasure to introduce Dr. David Kelley. Dr. Kelley is a professional philosopher, teacher, and writer. After earning his PhD in philosophy from Princeton University in 1975, he joined the philosophy department at Vassar College, where he taught a wide range of courses at all levels. He has also taught philosophy at Brandeis University. As a philosopher, his specialty is epistemology, the field concerned with the nature of human knowledge and the methods of acquiring it. His books in this area include The Evidence of the Senses, a treatise in the epistemology of perception, and The Art of Reasoning, one of the most widely used logic textbooks in the country. He was also one of the founders of Vassar College's cognitive science program, in which he continues to teach periodically. In 1990, he founded the Objectivist Center in Poughkeepsie, New York, where he continues to serve as its executive director. The center sponsors research and education in objectivism, the philosophy originated by the novelist and philosopher Ayn Rand. An internationally recognized expert on objectivism, he has lectured on the subject at Harvard, Yale, University of Michigan, Berkeley, Amherst, and many other colleges and universities. He has also addressed the Mont Pelerin Society, the Free Press Association, the Cato Institute, and the Heartland Institute, as well as many objectivist conferences. He has lectured and published widely on a wide range of political and cultural topics, from the logic of Sherlock Holmes's reasoning to the cultural meaning of the September 11th attacks. Please welcome Dr. David Kelley.
Well, my role today is to try to provide some kind of broader perspective, historical and philosophical, for all the many, many specific and fascinating things that we've been hearing about in earlier lectures. So I want to take us back historically in time, some 30 to 40 years ago, 30 to 40,000 years ago. Human beings began making images, like these that are from caves in southern France. Rock paintings like this appear at many other sites throughout the world at roughly the same time. And by this point, our early ancestors were probably also telling stories as they huddled around fires against the chill of the Ice Age. Stories of glorious hunts, hard winters, perhaps tales of gods and tribal heroes. The earliest confirmed musical instruments date from this era as well. These are slightly later in time. They were found in China at a site on the Yellow River, and the archaeologists who found these flutes made from the bones of birds found that they still played multi-tone music. These examples of painting, music, and perhaps literature are striking because the anthropological context raises an obvious question. Why did human beings begin doing this sort of thing? Unlike the stone tools, the various kinds of stone tools, bone tools, and so forth that humans invented for hunting, cooking, building, scraping animal skins, and the like, these artifacts have no clear survival value. Why did people whose life expectancy was probably 20 years at best, whose daily life was a struggle for subsistence, whose life expectancy, why would they spend their time and energy making two-dimensional images in dark places like caves? Why would they spend their time and energy making these incredibly sophisticated instruments to make sounds that had no linguistic or communicative function that anyone can relate to survival? Why did they invent stories, legends of things that probably never happened? What was the purpose of these activities? What needs did they satisfy? Some anthropologists have argued that the appearance of art at roughly this time in the development of in evolutionary time reflects a significant advance in human cognitive development, the emergence of a spiritual capacity in our species as the final stage in the evolution of the human mind. Be that as it may, by the time the first civilizations emerged in Sumeria, Egypt, the Indus Valley, China, and the Americas, art was a well-established part of human life. virtually every culture at every period has had some form of painting, sculpture, music, literature, poetry, and epic narrative, for example. Why has art been such a pervasive feature of human life? Well, some theorists have offered purely reductive explanations, including some in the newly emerging field of evolutionary psychology. One theory, for example, says that art is one of a number of human activities that have no direct survival value but serve the purpose of sexual selection. Like the peacock's tail. The peacock's tail is, in terms of the biology of survival, kind of a drag to generate, build out of the food that you eat and then have to cart around. But it is, for that very reason, a display of excess fitness and well-fettedness. And female peacocks have evolved to find this attractive because it's a token, an outward sign of inward biological grace, so to speak. Well, the theory goes that art is like that. It takes so much time and effort that has no use that it's attractive as a sign of intelligence, skill, dexterity, or whatever, indicating that the person has these survival-enhancing attributes in such abundance that he can afford to throw them away. Well, if we set our minds to it, I'm sure we can think of some examples of artistic performances that function as sexual plumage. But I think this kind of reductive explanation is uncalled for, unnecessary, and misses an obvious point. And I would say the same of other reductive explanations, that to the effect that art serves the function of display of wealth or power or ideological domination or the like. I think it's much more reasonable to interpret the universality of art, despite its obvious despite any obvious utilitarian function, as a reflection of genuine cognitive and emotional needs that human beings have, as a reflection of their cognitive capacities that do enable us to live the way we do. I think these needs arise from the unique human power to think in abstractions. An abstract concept, like tree, to take a simple one, allows us to think about an entire class of objects in terms of a single mental unit and word. As a cognitive device, the concept tree reduces the mass of all the individual concrete specific trees with all their variations and peculiarities to a single mental unit that allows us to treat trees as if they were identical and to think about them as a single class. Speaking now about the universality of our concepts. And as a result, we can form general ideas about the properties that all trees share, such as needing water, the fact that they are alive, that they're plant matter, and so forth. And the consequences of this power to think universally are enormous. The most obvious, to pick only two of many, many, many that we could talk about, language is perhaps the most obvious. The words we use to represent our concepts allow us to communicate. They allow us to learn from the experience of others, make agreements to cooperate, form societies that are based on abstract rules rather than inbred instincts, and transmit knowledge and culture across generations so that human experience becomes cumulative. Concepts also expand our knowledge of nature through enabling science. By comparing and contrasting instances of some phenomenon that we have conceptualized, say the metal copper, we can identify causal regularities that are not evident to the naked eye, like the melting point of copper, or the fact that it is capable of combining with tin to form a very valuable new kind of metal, bronze, to pick an early example of a human discovery. But a consequence of human conceptual abilities that is particularly important for my topic today is the ability to conceive of ourselves, to conceive of our lives as wholes. Because we can abstract from the immediacy and concreteness of sense perception, We can think about our futures, form long-range plans, imagine new ways of living, deliberate about what to do, and choose among alternative goals, projects, and actions. I think the most obvious example of the ability to grasp our lives as wholes is simply the awareness of death, the conscious knowledge that our lives are finite and will come to an end. The earliest known work of literature, the earliest narrative that has survived in written form, is in large part a meditation on death. This is the Epic of Gilgamesh, written, or at least the first full written version, dates from about 1700 BC, about 1,000 years before most of the Bible began, books of the Bible began to be written. We're introduced to Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk, as a warrior hero, indifferent to the risks of battle. But the grief over the death of his friend Enkidu sends Gilgamesh on a long journey quest to find the secret of eternal life. And you see here how he is filled with despair at the imminent inevitability of his own death and the desire to banish it. When his quest fails, Gilgamesh reconciles himself to his fate, and some versions of the narrative offer the solace that his name and works will be remembered forever, marveled at by generations to come, that of all mankind, all that are known, none will leave a monument for generations to come to compare with his. Bravado, despair, vicarious survival, immortality through one's works. These reactions to the inevitability of death have been played out in countless variations in works of art of all media over the centuries. But death is only the end of life. Along the way, we face choices about actions, goals, and ways of life. Precisely for that reason, we need some method of choosing among them, choosing among alternatives. We need normative concepts, standards, values, ideals, things to guide our choices and our expectations about life. We need some conception of what things are good for us and bad, which actions are right and which wrong, what kinds of person are honorable, what kinds of goals are worth pursuing, and what kind of life is worthy. Every culture has had some form of moral code that provided ethical norms and ideals, usually in the form of religions, philosophical writings, customs, traditions, laws. Normative standards are an absolutely universal aspect of human societies and cultures, and they are a pervasive aspect of our personal lives. Normative abstractions give rise to a range of emotions that are uniquely human. All emotions have some normative component, at least in the sense of reacting to things as good or bad for us, having a positive or a negative valence in relationship to our lives. And we share with other animals the basic repertoire of emotions like fear toward things that are threatening, or desire for things from which we anticipate pleasure. But our capacity for abstraction gives rise to feelings that have inherently conceptual contents. For example, indignation and outrage are emotions directed at what we perceive as unjust. Unjust is a conceptual content. Reverence and awe are responses to things that we regard as exalted in some way. Romantic love is a desire for a kind of connection, intimacy, and mutual awareness that goes beyond the purely sensory aspects of sexual attraction. But the question remains, why are we drawn to artistic means, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, of dealing with issues of life and death? I mean, after all, we could formulate these issues in abstractions. They arise as abstractions from our conceptual capacity. And we can think of them that way. We can think in the abstract about standards of good and bad, and right and wrong, and honor and depravity, in the form of the writings of philosophers, or religious sermons, or self-help books, or advice columns. So why do we need stories like Gilgamesh, or paintings, or music? Well, the reason, I think, is this. It has to do with the limitations of abstractions, the cost, we might say, of living by abstractness. The price we pay for the enormous cognitive power of abstractions is the loss of the specificity and the immediacy of sense perception. The power of abstraction comes from integrating an entire class of things, an entire category of things, into one cognitive unit, abstracting from all their differences and treating them as if they were alike. You've seen one tree, you've seen them all. That's not quite literally true, because I got the word see in there. That's a perceptual statement. But if you think one tree, you've thought them all when you say that trees are plants. But trees are not alike, and neither are people, and neither are lives, and neither are experiences, not when we look at the actual concrete reality of them. In thinking abstractly, we forego the concreteness of real things as we perceive them. Consider, for example, the concept of love. This is an enormously abstract concept covering a huge range of variation in human feelings that differ in intensity, duration, and many, many other qualities. I mean, here there is the love represented here by Penelope from Homer's epic, the Odysseus. The mature, tested love of a wife for her long overdue husband, Odysseus. He's been wandering around the Mediterranean for 10 years trying to get back from the Trojan Wars, which were themselves 10 years. And here she is, sad for his absence, but at the same time, she is running his estate. She is in command of herself. She is engaged in various stratagems to hold off the suitors. You see behind her the loom, which, if you remember the story, was one of her stratagems. This is one kind of love. And then we have, at what we might say an opposite axis, we have the headstrong love of Juliet for Romeo. Juliet, who is in the first, to quote a phrase from is always stuck in my head, the first fine, careless rapture of young love. She cannot, this is from the famous scene 3 in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, where she is in her chamber by herself. It's a monologue. It's in the afternoon. She can't wait for the night to come because Romeo will come with it. Come night, come Romeo. She's not about to wait 20 years for the guy to get there. Night can't come soon enough. She is a teenager in the first flush of love, and she can't wait to consummate it. Those are two wildly different concretes, both falling under the same concept. Another dimension of abstraction that represents a kind of cost is the immediacy of perceptual experience. As I hope those two previous examples illustrated, when we get down to concretes, we have a greater immediacy of that is real, that's something that is real, present. The word love and the abstract statements that we can make about it are really, in a sense, pale reflections of the reality of the experience itself. Abstractions simply do not have the immediacy, the power, the reality, the felt constraint, and the other things that make experience real. They lack the sheer presence of the world. So to keep our abstractions tied to reality, we need to embody them, re-embody them in concrete form, to clothe them in specific forms that unite the universality of the abstraction with the specificity and the immediacy of experience. And this is especially important in regard to the normative abstractions that guide our lives. If those standards exist in our mind only as pale abstractions, they will lack the reality and the motivating power that they need to have if they are truly to guide our lives. Human cultures have invented many, many ways to embody abstractions. Rituals, ceremonies, holidays, all in their different ways, help us appreciate the meanings of passages of life, birth, marriage, death, the seasons, in the case of the holidays, victories, which we celebrate. Myths and legends give us heroes, concrete images of our ideals embodied in the flesh. Embodied abstractions are not equivalent to direct perception because they do embody abstract ideas or values. sometimes whole worldviews. They are human creations that are designed through cultural evolution or through deliberate design to convey meanings that are larger than the specific object or event that is represented. And art, I think, is the most powerful means of creating embodied abstractions. In art, we can experience perceptual objects and worlds that are extraordinarily rich in meaning through the artist's work of shaping the object, shaping the creation, the artwork, in order to embody a very specific vision. In the hands of a master, artistic creativity can provide the most complex, the most precise, the most sophisticated, the most subtle, the most evocative. In short, the most powerful and effective form of embodied abstraction. So I want to illustrate this before I close. I want to illustrate this role of art and the power of art by talking about a particular kind of embodied abstraction, one that I think is particularly important to me, and I think also to the theme and point of the conference, and that is the ideal. An ideal is a particular kind of embodied abstraction. It is a high point on some dimension of evaluation. An ideal is, it's the brass ring, it's the Olympic gold, it's scoring 100%. It's the heroic act, the perfect day, the man of your dreams, the person of unimpeachable character. And I know cynics scoff at those who speak of ideals, but I really think it's the cynic who is naive here. To live is to act, and to act is to engage in the pursuit of goals. Life is a constant striving for what we conceive as good for us. It's in the very nature of valuing things that we regard them as values. It's in the very nature of striving for those values that we succeed or fail, show ourselves worthy or unworthy, take credit or blame for what we do. Our lives are shot through with normative judgments of that kind. We make them daily about ourselves and about other people. And any such judgment implies a standard of comparison, a benchmark representing the best that is possible. A benchmark that is, to be effective, must be embodied and concrete. The Greeks of the classical era placed a huge value on physical beauty, grace, and, in the case of men, athletic strength. Sculptors of that era strove to represent the ideal, as in the work of Polyclitus, the Doryphorus. Unfortunately, we don't have the original, which I believe was bronze. Perhaps someone can correct me, but we only have this marble Roman copy. But it, I think, captures at least some of what we imagine the original might have been like. I show it partly because it was taken at the time and by later sculptors as setting the canon for representing the male body. Every culture and religion has found some way to embody its conception of the human ideal. Gilgamesh, for example, was, in Sumerian legend, was the ideal of strength, energy, courage, and wisdom. I think it's striking that in three of the world's major religions, Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism, were associated with a single founding figure, Christ, Muhammad, and Buddha, respectively, who were not just teachers, but exemplars, ideals of the religion that they taught. Okay? Jesus, Muhammad, and Buddha did not merely introduce the ideas as philosophers, or actually more like today, gurus that you would see on presenting a new way of life, but they themselves exemplified it. And at least in the case of Christianity, the narrative of Jesus' life is just about the only point that most Christians will agree on. All the doctrines, or almost all of them, are subject to dispute. And of course, the figure of Christ has been represented in countless artworks as an embodiment of certain ideals of Christian civilization. You've seen the Pietà already today. Here it is again. what strikes me from the perspective I'm speaking of now is the thin, unworldly nature of Christ's body here, as Michelangelo represents it, so different from the Doryphorus, the spear bearer, soldier. Thin, emaciated, unworldly, and here we see the embodiment of his self-sacrifice and departure for another world. The core themes of Christianity represented here in an idealization. More secular ideals have been the focus of artists in the modern era. I use modern in a more encompassing way than Stephen. I mean, since the Enlightenment and afterwards. Artists have created ideals of the quest for social justice, as in Hugo's Les Miserables. Ideals of joy as a triumph over pain in the course of life, as in the music of Beethoven. Ideals of creativity, as in, this is a favorite painting of mine, Delacroix's wonderful portrait of Chopin, the romantic creative genius. Ideals of nature and its relationship to man as a place of exploration, beauty, excitement, as in this work of the Hudson Valley School. And there are many, many others idealizations of people, character traits, modes of life, experiences. Painting, I think, like poetry, is particularly good at capturing the ideally intense, an experience of ideal intensity. There are as many ideals as there are virtues of character, realms of achievement, modes of experience, ways of life, and as many ways of representing them in effective, emotionally moving forms as there are creative and talented artists. I'm not saying, and I want to make this clear as I conclude, I'm not saying that the representation of ideals is the only function of art, but I believe it's a vital function, and it's one that's been neglected in the past century. When I was preparing these remarks, I hadn't yet seen Stephen's outline, and I think I don't need to say a whole lot at this point, but in recent art, modernists have tended to focus on formal aspects of art, seeking innovations in aesthetic technique and the use of medium and so forth. At its best, modernism has done this, but to the exclusion of content to an awful extent. And postmoderns, when they are not engaged in outright nihilism, have tended to represent ideals only in the mocking and ironic manner of adolescents who are afraid to be taken seriously. And meanwhile, the enormous hunger for the experience of ideals has had to be satisfied by popular art, film, music, fiction, with their simple and often sentimental templates of physical courage and everlasting love. I think our ideals deserve, and they certainly need, the skill of artists, the excitement of artistic innovation, and the experience of ideals rendered powerfully and insightfully. And so I hope that the art and the artists of the future will return to this timeless task. Thank you.